All right, so I'll teach just a little bit more about what my grandpa taught me. Like, one example would be, uh, well, one thing that we kind of like talked about was I had like OCD rituals, and they say like when you have OCD, it's to alleviate anxiety, um, through like doing rituals. So, for instance, you have a bad thought, and then you knock on wood, and that knocking on wood is supposed to stop that bad thought from happening. But I was all, I developed rituals where I would like knock on wood and stuff. And the idea like knock on wood, it confirms itself because you're knocking, and that's confirming the body, right? But it's also taking your mind off yourself by doing the ritual. By doing the ritual, it's taking your mind off yourself. So it could also be the higher aspiration behind the knocking on wood would be breaking free of the self. It takes your mind off yourself to the knocking on the wood, and that could that ritual, those obsessive compulsive rituals can help break you free of the self. It's kind of paradoxical. It could be both self-confirmatory and an attempt to transcend the self by, you're knocking on wood. That's a ritual, and it's taking your thoughts off of yourself to the act of knocking. Any ritual will take you outside of yourself, right? And the idea is the transcendence of the self is a flow, and that's what people really want, right? Another example of that would be, or just like some of the things my grandpa taught me was, I remember I was listening to this lecture that this like is a black motivational speaker, and he was like, "Yo, you gotta kill it, man. You gotta, just go out there and kick ass and give it your all, and you're gonna make it, man. And you're gonna get all that money, and he was doing all that, right? And I was like, what do you think about this, Grandpa? My grandpa said that he thought that, the ego is magnificent in its achievements, but it's limited in its reach. So my grandpa would say the ego can be beneficial, trying to go all out and get something. He said this guy was, you said you could tell by this guy's tone, his emotionality. He's very stuck in it. He was trapped in his ego, and he's trying to make things happen. Yo, you gotta get that, man. He's trying to make things happen. My grandpa says that's not the flow, but my grandpa says there is no formula for the flow. And by raising his level of aliveness, and by going all out, he can get in the flow. And also, my grandpa had this saying where he would say, you cannot get there from here, but only those who refuse to accept that will understand that there is here, or will discover that there is here. And that's the idea that the flow is always here. My grandpa would say, you can't be forgiven. You already are forgiven. I mean, he would say, you're already forgiven. Like people, can I be forgiven? You're already forgiven. The flow is always there. You just have to let go to the flow, right? But it's not a hippie thing. It's not like, okay, let go. Because my grandpa said that's not the flow either. That's the idea that the flow only comes through grace. You can't make the flow happen. So it's like it only comes through grace. And that was the idea that, I asked my grandpa, like, what does it Muslims mean by, Allah can choose who he wants to save? And it's the idea that you don't save yourself. The flow comes through grace. And so I guess like even like and I talked about like there's this one ritual where the Muslims or the Hindus would let go of a horse and let the horse go wherever it wanted to, and then wherever the horse went, then they would conquer that city. And I asked my grandpa, what does that represent? And he said something like that the acknowledgement that there is a flow, and that you're not making it happen, but you let the horse do it, and then so that it's an acknowledgement that there is a higher power, that there is the flow. And because if you just decide, I'm going to conquer this city and this city, no, let the horse do it. And this idea that you don't necessarily make things happen, that there is the acknowledgement that there is a flow. All right. Now, my grandpa would try to make things very rational, though, and that's the thing. But I think that, that you can get into the magical type of stuff. So I'll get to that later. But but yeah, but the idea of existential metapsychiatry was like existentialism is that you take responsibility, right? But I'm gonna get to that. You take responsibility in the sense that My grandpa would say, you take responsibility for upgrading your software. So just an example of that would be, let me think. Well, yeah, just the idea too, like I was saying, okay, like the idea of Medusa. Medusa is raped, right? And then she gets those like the snakes in her hair, and then she starts killing people, and she's really depressed, and she's like a victim, right? And it's very self-confirmatory. She's very upset and emotional, and she's really trapped in her idea that she's a victim. But then Perseus cuts off her head. And Perseus is descendant of the sky god, and that's kind of like higher consciousness. But the idea behind that, I think, would be, my grandpa would say, you're not your body. So like, yeah, something bad happens to you, like you scrape your knee. Okay, so then if you're like a little kid and you scrape your knee, and then your mom and dad go up to you, oh no, his poor Neil, and then they make you into a victim, and then you start to cry and stuff. But if but I gotta be like, just don't make a big deal about it. He's not his body, right? But then you could say like, oh, that's just a right winger thing. Oh, don't care about the poor. Oh, just be emotionally cold. But my grandpa would say that there's a difference between the impersonal and the transpersonal. Now, I think that's the mistake that my parents made, because my dad just believed in Darwinism. He never understood my grandpa's teachings. My grandpa never taught my dad, because my dad never asked any questions. My grandpa got his PhD when he was 40. My dad was in metapsychiatry. My dad was already graduated from college. But I think that my mom and dad interpreted metapsychiatry as being impersonal. Like, oh, so because I wanted to talk about the past. I want to talk about the basketball. Now, my grandpa would talk about, like, I remember I was watching this show on the Holocaust, or there was a show on the Holocaust that was on TV, and my grandpa said something like that it would be best if people would not rehash the past so much, but, you could acknowledge it and acknowledge that it was the software. My grandpa would say it's not the people, it's the software that's the problem. People could upgrade their software. And I understand that now, but at the time I didn't want to believe that. I want to believe, no, it's Darwinism, and white people have different genes and Jewish people have different genes, and it's inevitable based off the genetic Darwinism that there's going to be conflicts and stuff like that. But now I acknowledge this, what my grandpa was saying, the software, transcending, upgrading your software to mutual participation, to the flow, right? And that in that sense, there is no real innocent victims, but you just upgrade your software. But so then I want to talk to my mom and dad about the shoot away. My grandpa said that would be beneficial. It wouldn't be a big deal about what happened to my shot. I want to show my dad. But my grandpa talks about like this idea that if you're in the flow, you're in the eternal moment. And like, not rehashing the past about like the Holocaust or slavery and stuff. Because that could, first off, it could be an expression of dualistic software. Like someone could be like, oh, you trying to manipulate or virtue signal through it, right? Or manipulate. Oh, you guys owe me reparations, or, that type of stuff. And that could be predator prey, right? You can acknowledge it. And my grandpa would say, in the flow, you acknowledge, you see things as they are, and you can discern the best way to go about it without necessarily getting involved in the illusion of the separate self and dualistic software. But that's complicated. But my mom and dad interpreted my grandpa's teachings impersonally, like, oh yeah, don't help the poor. That's not what my grandpa says. My grandpa says that my mom expresses predator prey software. Like, oh yeah, they should just get a job. Yeah, in a sense that could be accurate, but if you're saying it in emotional tone, in a way that's predatory toward the person, that's not the flow. Or like, oh yeah, don't talk about the past, Ryan. Your dad's never going to talk to you. Can't you get over the past? Yeah, my mom thinks that she's doing what my grandpa teaches, but that's not what my grandpa teaches. My grandpa teaches the flow. And he would say that sometimes it could be appropriate to talk about the past, especially in this case. I think it would be appropriate about the shoe machine fixed my shot. But because I want to rekindle, I want to establish a normal, healthy relationship with my mom and dad, and I think that's essential because they have a false conception of what happened in the past. They think, and I think my grandpa was a part of that. They think that so something wrong with me. My shot got messed up. It was something wrong with me, they think. And I tried to make things happen. No, if it wasn't for the shoot away machine, none of that stuff would have happened. I wish that they could just fucking listen to me. But so they take the impersonal lens, like, oh, okay, oh, so you shouldn't talk about the past, huh? Because then it's not the flow. Okay, well, Ryan, everything's just fine. Just, we're never going to talk to you again. That's impersonal, my grandpa would say. That's not transpersonal. If they were in transpersonal consciousness, my mom has developed a condescending, contemptuous attitude toward me, and it's due to ignorance. It's ignorance and it's stubbornness, and it's not the flow. It's impersonal. It's not transpersonal. And I think that my grandpa kind of taught me that people can get those two mixed up. They could think that by being impersonal, they're being transpersonal. Like, oh, I'm just like the example of like my mom. Like my grandpa would say, if you're in the flow, you can discern that not giving the poor money might be the best thing for the poor and having them get a job. But that's not always the case. My grandpa would say in the flow, first off, like my grandpa said that it can be a ritualistic practice for you to give, to let go of attachments. And again, also in the flow, you can discern. There's not always a strict formula. Sometimes it would be beneficial to give somebody something. If you're in the flow, you can discern that. But, if someone's just memorizing my grandpa's teachings and he's in impersonal software, you could think, oh, I'm being in the flow by not talking about the past. Or, my grandpa say that's memorizing. They don't really understand the flow. And my mom and dad, I think my grandpa says that he admits he cast pearls of swine, and he gave them teachings like, yeah, Ryan just, needs to accept everything's just fine. And if you're in the eternal moment, you don't talk about the past. But they don't realize that sometimes talking about the past is okay. And if I talk about the shoe machine and I reestablish a normal relationship, that should be good. That's a part of the flow. But they're stuck in impersonal software. My grandpa would say, it's impersonal, and that's the most narrow form of consciousness. That's the most narrow, restrictive form of consciousness. Very self-confirmatory. Like just an example of that, like my grandpa taught, like forgiveness. My grandpa would say, you don't forgive anybody because there is no person. So you don't forgive the person. My grandpa says, you just, by forgiveness, what that means is you see the person's software and you acknowledge that person is not their software. But my grandpa would say, but that doesn't mean that you start hanging out with the person again. Like, for instance, somebody kills your sister, let's say, right? My grandpa, a Christian might say, okay, I forgive him. And then they might hang out with him and eat lunch with him or something that next day. But my grandpa would say, if you really forgive somebody, you said you don't forgive anybody because there is no buddy. There is no person. The self is an illusion. But my grandpa would say, if you're in the flow, that person sinned, or that person killed your sister, you acknowledge that is not that person. That is that person's software, but he can upgrade his software. But, my grandpa would say, but that doesn't mean that you just let him go on and keep killing other people's sisters. He said, you might want to put that person in prison to protect him and others from his software. From the software, it's not his software, from the software that he's expressing that he can upgrade. My grandpa would say, the ultimate goal would be rehabilitation and to get him to upgrade his software to mutual participation, oneness, consciousness, so on and so forth. But my grandpa would say that, but you don't, like my grandpa said that, like Hillary Clinton says, like, she's sorry after something happens, right? She'll say, like, I forget what it was, like she did something and she said, I'm sorry. But my grandpa said, just saying sorry means nothing. What you have to do is you have to acknowledge the software that led to that problem. And that's how the person can, quote unquote, be forgiven, by acknowledging the limited level of software that he's expressing and then upgrading it. But an impersonal person would take my grandpa's teachings and misinterpret it like, oh, okay, so yeah, I don't have to forgive. I don't have to forgive nobody because there is nobody. And then they might just act like a jackass and think that they're in transpersonal consciousness. But you see what I'm saying? It's hard to explain, but there's a difference between transpersonal and impersonal consciousness, my grandpa says. Transpersonal and impersonal consciousness. And people can get those two mixed up. it's hard to explain, but I'm just kind of rambling now. But so let me think about what else my grandpa taught me. Like one thing that my grandpa taught me was the story of Lilith, where Lilith wants, because I asked him what does it mean, the story of Lilith, when Lilith is on top of Adam and then she's kicked out of the garden. She has sex with him on the top. And my grandpa said, well, maybe she wanted to be equal. And my grandpa was like, and that's not the flow, because if you want to be superior or you want to be inferior, neither one of those is the flow, because you still believe you're a separate self and you're trying to be superior or inferior. That's superior, inferior software. But my grandpa says also equal software is not the flow. Wanting to be equal with somebody, like feminists might want to be equal to men. My grandpa says you don't care about if you're equal to them or superior or inferior. You just go all out. You upgrade your software. You go all out, and you're in inquiry. You expand your awareness, right? And if you're trying to be equal, then that's still based around the illusion that you are a self and that there's another, and you're trying to be equal to that person. And that's still self-confirmatory. And my grandpa says there is no self. So another example of that would be like my grandpa would talk about activism and how activism is not, well, first off, there's impersonal, interpersonal, and transpersonal, my grandpa says, right? But like activism. Okay, my grandpa said he didn't like reggae music because he said a lot of it's like activism. And also I think, a lot of it's like smoking weed and being against the society. And my grandpa says you don't want to be against anything, because if you're against something, that's self-confirmatory, right? And emotions self-confirmatory. Like people who be like, oh, I fucking hate meat eaters. Or, my grandpa would say, yeah, eating vegetarian, there could be a benefit to that as a ritual. Because, when you eat it, it can, my grandpa could say it's easier to digest, and that's less self-confirmatory, and, so on and so forth. But my grandpa would say, but just eating vegetarian won't make you get in the flow. And if you're like, oh, I hate meat eaters, and it's all emotional, that's still self-confirmatory. You still believe that you're a separate self. You're not in the flow. But my grandpa would be like, a lot of the activism, like reggae music, a lot of it's activism and stuff. And he said, my grandpa would say that a lot of it's self-confirmatory. And my grandpa talked about Sojourner Truth. There's this woman, it means, and he said that she didn't like fight slavery. He said that she just walked away. What she did was, he said that Sojourner Truth means seeker of truth. So she was just my grandpa said she was just in inquiry. So she wasn't fighting anything. She wasn't an activist. Because when you're fighting something, that's self-confirmatory. You still believe that you're a separate self. And that's not necessarily the flow. Now, in the flow, sometimes people will fight. You never know. Like there's no formula for the flow. And fighting can get someone in the flow. It could get someone in trouble, right? And then regardless, but there is no formula. But my grandpa would say in the flow, Sojourner Truth didn't need to fight slavery. She just walked away because she was in inquiry. Now, I thought that was white supremacy again. I'm like, oh, so you're blaming the victim. So the slaves who remained slaves, it was because they wanted it, huh? Or because they weren't in the flow and they weren't in inquiry like Sojourner Truth was. Again, I thought it was white supremacist. But my grandpa would say, like, fighting, activism doesn't necessarily help. What helps is just being in the flow and transcending the self in inquiry. And I'm still trying to grapple with all this stuff. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. So, I'm trying to think what else. Oh, like, another thing was, like, I would listen to music with my grandpa, like The Temptations. And a lot of the music would be about relationships. And my grandpa would say that music was self-confirmatory, like a lot of the pop music and all that. I'll get to this in the next lecture about the pop music, but a lot of it, he says, self-confirmatory about relationships, like love songs. But my grandpa says, that's love and relationships, that's self-confirmatory. There is no self, there is no other. Relationships are an illusion. And my grandpa didn't like a lot of the music, like Billie Eilish. My grandpa listened to one of the Billie Eilish songs about her wanting to be choked and stuff. My grandpa was like, he didn't like that music because he said that's just self-confirmatory. Now, I would say that my grandpa might say there's a higher aspiration behind that, maybe wanting to die to the self, being choked, die to the self and stuff. But, all right, this is kind of a crazy lecture, but I'll get more into some stuff in the next ones.